Hello, class. Welcome back. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving break. And over the next couple of weeks, we will be finishing up our discussion of bioethical topics. In particular, we will be circling back to a question that I posed in one of the very first lectures in this class. What should the limits of healthcare and what should the limits of bioethics be? And there's some squabbling within both the bioethics field and within medical context more generally concerning the answer to this question. So this week, we'll be talking about social determinants of health and whether or not we should place these under the purview of bioethics. And next week, we'll be looking at some of the larger societal factors in more detail, including dietary discussions, transportation, etc. But today I want to set the stage for these larger discussions. In particular, as I said, we'll be revisiting that key question brought up in the beginning of class. But in particular, we'll be looking at Weston's argument that social factors need to be included in bioethics proper, and that focusing specifically on questions that arise in clinical settings does a disservice to the field in two fundamental ways. And we'll be looking at one critique of Weston's argument. Now, this argument about whether or not to include social factors very much sets the stage for more specific concerns over social determinants of health, as we'll see. Wednesday, we'll be looking at an argument for including social determinants of health within the bioethics sphere. And on Friday, we'll be looking at one critique of that position, where two very prominent bioethicists argue, well, they ask the question, why should we care, right? Bioethics has a very specific job to do in clinical settings, and expanding the sphere bans bioethics beyond the realm where it does important work. And it dilutes the effectiveness of the field, so to speak. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. First, we need to set the stage. So what is this key question? Well, the key question concerns what is bioethics. And throughout this semester, we looked at bioethics largely within the clinical and research setting. And remember, right at the beginning, the definition of bioethics is the following. It's the study of the ethical issues emerging from advances in the biological sciences and medicine. Now, this includes a broad array of topics, such as issues over life and death. We talked about abortion, we talked about euthanasia, we talked about the allocation of healthcare resources, such as questions that arise when we discuss distribution of key ventilators. We talked about organs, etc. And we discussed the right to refuse medical care. Should we be prioritizing autonomy or should we be prioritizing beneficence? What happens when we have discrepancies concerning what a patient's wishes are in end-of-life care? Should we listen to the parents? Should we listen to siblings, children, etc.? What if there is a DNR? All of these various questions. And we talked about privacy and whatnot. Many of these questions arise within clinical settings, and they involve decisions within groups, yes, but within small groups and by individuals. Now, right at the beginning, when we were setting the stage for these discussions, I discussed how there is a disagreement over the limits of bioethics. There's one camp where they argue that the field should concern itself with all questions involving biology and medicine. And as we saw previously, that concerning when we looked at that very general definition of bioethics, that seems to intimate that all questions that arise when we're talking about biology and medicine in general fall under the purview of bioethics. However, as Bouchot and Childress have argued, and many prominent names in the field have argued, the field actually has a very specific function within medical contexts, and thus It should focus only on the subset of these questions that arise within clinical settings. What do bioethicists do? Bioethicists help medical professionals by either providing the tools for them to make decisions on their own or by providing advice to help make these difficult decisions that arise in medical contexts. They have a very specific role, and as such, they should focus on mastering this role and addressing these particular sets of questions. So you can see this tension here, right? And the tension is broader because many factors can influence our health. And when we tarry with not only the question of what the limits of bioethics should be, it also points us to the questions concerning what should the limits of medicine be. Right? Many factors influence the health of patients that lie outside of the clinical setting. Be that diet, be that my excessive drinking of coffee. You know, I do enjoy coffee. Be that exercise habits, environmental factors such as the quality of air that you're breathing, whether or not you were born next to a Superfund site, all of these various questions impact, or all of these various factors impact health. So we're going to be engaging with these two overlapping questions then for the next 2 weeks. What should the limits of bioethics be? And what should the limits of healthcare be? What should fall within the purview of medicine and what should fall without? Now, Weston has a very specific answer to this question. But again, he does acknowledge the critiques that arise. So, concerning the question, should social factors be included in the purview of bioethics and medicine more generally, Weston emphatically answers yes. And he uses two stories in order to put forth or support his point. So I actually have two block quotes in this presentation because I think it's important to present the two case studies in the way that he specifically presents them. So right at the beginning of Weston's piece, he's like, this all begins with a story. And interestingly, this story was originally used to discuss the limits of healthcare. So Kay Zola recounts a parable told to him by a physician friend. I'm standing by the shore of a swiftly flowing river, and I hear a cry from a drowning man. So I jump into the river, pull him to shore. This is of no relation to Peter Singer, by the way. Jump into the river, pull him to shore, and apply artificial respiration. Just when he begins to breathe, there's another cry for help. So I jump into the river, reach him, pull him to shore, apply artificial respiration, and then just as he begins to breathe, another cry for help. So back into the river again, reaching, pulling, applying, breathing, and then another yell. Again and again, without end, goes the sequence. I'm so busy jumping in, pulling them to shore, applying artificial respiration, that I have no time to see who the hell is upstream pushing them all in. End quote. So what does this mean? Why did the physician tell this story to Zola? Well, there are difficult ethical questions that arise as the drowning cry out and are pulled to shore. So it shows the distinction between critical care and questions that arise within clinical settings, but the importance that larger societal impacts play within medical contexts. So when we're just looking at the drowning people, when we have a lot of drowning people and there's only one medical professional there trying to ensure that all of these people do not drown, right? They're pulling them ashore, applying artificial respiration, pulling another one to shore, so forth and so on. You have a wide range of questions that can arise just looking at that initial point of contact, such as how should we decide who to rescue when not everyone can be saved? Let's say the person pushes 3 people in, but you only have time to save 2. Which one do we not save, right? And we've talked about that. How can we tell suicides from accidental victims, right? Does intention matter here? Do indignant drowners have the right to be saved, etc., etc.? But the point of the story is not to highlight these questions that arise down the river. The point of this story is to show the importance of the factors that influence the clinical setting. So, what about the person that's pushing people into the river? Shouldn't this be an important component of addressing the problems that are brought to the forefront in this parable? So, Weston wants to argue, utilizing this parable, that bioethics typically focuses on downstream problems. Right? They focus on, say, questions concerning we should save and how to best allocate resources in clinical settings and how best to respect the privacy of patients and the autonomy and the choice making of patients, how best to deal with situations where the autonomy of patients could be compromised, etc., etc. What happens when we need to, say, question the rationality of a particular patient? Do we focus on benefiting the patient? Do we focus on respecting their choices? Do we focus on the just allocation of resources within clinical setting? I can go on and on and on. What about abortion? What about all of these very end of life care, euthanasia? Should it be allowed? And we've been talking about these very important issues throughout the semester. However, Weston wants to argue that yes, these are an important component of bioethics. These are important ethical questions that arise in medical contexts. But what about downstream problems? What about all of those factors that influence the particular situations that you will find yourself in making decisions? What about the factors that influence the health of the patients that we see before we see them? So this is where social determinants of health come into play, and this is where the various other larger components or societal components that influence health, such as environmental factors, dietary factors, etc., that we'll be discussing for the next 2 weeks. So Weston is setting the stage by saying that social factors matter, and they matter in bioethics for 2 key reasons that we'll get to. So just to pull a quote from the Weston reading, a representative list of bioethical problems include, and I just went through, abortion, terminating impaired newborns, euthanasia, truth-telling, confidentiality, experimentation, consent, gene therapy, reproductive control, allocating resources, rights, whether or not we have a right to medical care, etc. And we've talked about all of these in the class. But nearly all of these problems are representative as decisional problems facing specific afflicted individuals, their families, and most prominently the attending medical personnel. However, it all begins with a story to highlight how this is only part of the picture when we're making bioethical decisions. So in order to highlight how this is only part of the story, he provides us with another case study. As we all know, in bioethics, case studies play an important role. And so we'll be turning our attention for the rest of this lecture to the second case study. And it's a rather long case study, but I think it's important to read through it. And this highlights why including social factors matters so much for bioethics, as we'll see. So the first parable highlights how social factors influence key biomedical or medical contexts and how we should take that into account. And this sort of expands that analysis to specifically show how bioethics is limited by not taking social factors into account. So again, this is from the Weston text. 3 physicians serve an isolated rural area. Dr. S refuses on religious grounds to perform any abortion unless actually necessary to save the mother's life. And I do want to note that this case study is not fictional. This case study is a synopsis of a case that was brought to the court system, to the legal court of law. Names, of course, have been changed to protect the innocent. you know. So, three physicians serve an isolated rural area. Dr. S refuses on religious grounds to perform an abortion unless actually necessary to save the mother's life. Dr. G and H will perform non therapeutic abortions, but only Dr. G takes Medicaid patients. Dr. H feels that the Medicaid reimbursement mechanism is grossly unfair to physicians, and that the paperwork and time involved in getting the meager reimbursement from the agencies distracts significantly from the time he could spend providing care for patients. So it's onerous. Dr. G has become frustrated with the way she thinks people complicate their own lives and compromise their own health and the health of their families by not controlling their family size. She therefore offers extensive birth control counseling whenever she delivers a child or performs an abortion. She also tells patients that after they have had 4 children or more than 2 abortions, she'll refuse to deliver another child or perform another abortion unless the patient or her mate consists to concurrent sterilization. Ms. Doe comes to Dr. G requesting an abortion. Ms. Doe is a mother of 4 who's tried an IUD unsuccessfully and finds other methods of birth control too much of a bother. Consequently, she's had 2 abortions as well. She's on welfare and unable to either afford Dr. H's services or to go to another area for abortion. But she is strongly opposed to sterilization. Should Dr. G insist on her policy? So we have this long, drawn out case where we have 3 doctors with 3 stances on whether or not they will provide abortions. Dr. S refusing, Dr. G and H both arguing that they will perform non therapeutic abortions, but Dr. H refusing because the Medicaid reimbursement is onerous. So we have Dr. G insisting that certain patients will strongly consider, we shall say, or undergo sterilization. So in the traditional bioethics context, the question then, as it was posed at the end of that case, is whether or not Dr. G should insist on her policy of sterilization. Is it within the is it within professional ethics that Dr. G has agreed to follow in order to request that particular policy, in order to request that procedure be done? Is it going to benefit the patient? Is it going to harm the patient? What about the autonomy of the patient? The patient clearly does not wish to undergo sterilization in that situation. But Dr. G is arguing that this will be beneficial to the patient, right? So again, when we take a traditional bioethics lens, we could argue here that there is a clear conflict here between beneficence and between respecting the autonomy of a patient. And we could also question whether or not Dr. G's policy is harmful to the patient. Is it breaking the principle of non-maleficence? So in traditional bioethics, Weston wants to argue that the question concerning Dr. G is what we typically focus on. However, there is so much going on contextually in that case that matters. But many of these factors, in order to focus on whether or not Dr. G should be pushing this particular policy, these factors are typically, they need to be ignored. Or I plead the fifth about whether or not I actually did this when I was a child trying to clean my room, but swept under the rug, so to speak. And Weston wants to argue that these societal factors matter. They matter because there are many other factors that influence the health of patients. They matter because the way that we answer even the traditional bioethics question will be impacted. And they matter because bioethics stance concerning largely focusing on clinical questions has sort of supported the medical blind spot, so to speak, concerning the importance that societal factors play in healthcare, in providing healthcare, and in healthcare settings more generally. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So downstream questions matter. So Weston argues the following, that Dr. G is not the only actor in the case. By focusing on Dr. G, we're not looking at the other actors that have contributed to the limitation of choices here, right? Dr. S's, we could ask other questions, such as, are Dr. S's religious scruples about a widely accepted procedure sufficient reason to refuse it? That's an important question, and we could argue both sides, right? What about in desperate cases? And indeed, we do have literature on those types of questions, and this is a very hot issue. Another question concerns Mrs. Doe's apparent irresponsibility that's created the dilemma in the first place. Is Dr. G entitled to insist upon her standard of responsibility, even when doing so has such an adverse impact on Miss Doe under these circumstances? What about all of the various societal factors that led to Miss Doe's choice making? What standards of responsibility should be put into place within medical contexts? Should it be the attending physician's right to determine what standard of responsibility is adhered to in those situations? This is another important set of questions. Second, the dilemma arises partially because only 3 doctors serve the primary care needs of the region. And as we discussed in the justice component of the class, healthcare resources, including healthcare services, are not equally distributed across regions in the United States. And in rural contexts, quality of healthcare services could be quite limited, and indeed are quite limited in certain contexts. So this brings up questions concerning the state of the healthcare system and access. And we discussed these questions as well when we talked about Daniel's benchmarks of care and questions concerning healthcare policy, healthcare systems, and equity. So in addition, it also brings up questions concerning who should be allowed to practice medicine. So for example, in this particular case, we have only 3 doctors serving the primary care needs of a large rural population. However, should healthcare practicing be limited to 3 highly trained individuals? Or should we adopt alternative systems, such as those in Great Britain, where midwives, licensed midwives, mind you, are typically used to provide general care, especially for expecting mothers? Is this the type of system we want? Or do we want to expand those who can practice medicine, etc.? Should we further compensate professionals who move into rural environments in order to provide health care? So for example, in Costa Rica, there are many rural areas and many rural populations. So the Costa Rican government actually subsidizes the cost of medical school. They subsidize the cost of medical school if a medical professional signs a contract stating that they will spend X number of years in a rural community providing care. For pay, of course, but this sort of incentivizes medical professionals moving into said rural communities, right? So do we want to adopt a framework like that? So all of these wider questions concerning the state of our healthcare system, its structure, how it's designed, and access have to be sort of swept under the rug for us to be focusing on that traditional bioethical question. But Weston wants to argue that these are playing important roles in all of these types of questions and all of these factors that sort of pushed us to ask these questions play important roles in framing that a particular case. Important roles that bioethics and medicine more generally should take into account. Right. So again, downstream problems. And finally, Dr. H refuses Medicaid abortions because he claims that he doesn't get paid enough for them to compensate his paperwork. So again, these systemic questions. So is Medicaid reimbursement inadequate? 1, 2, is it onerous? 3, if it is, can we justify a system where medical care for the poor is systematically maintained as second rate and marginal? That's another question that arises when we look at the wider social question, the wider social context. Is a system that encourages these onerous accommodations fair? Is it equitable, as Daniels would ask us to engage with? Is it equitable to the patients? What about the medical professionals? Is it equitable to Dr. H, whose medical practice is negatively impacted, and his ability to service patients is being negatively impacted by the system? Is that acceptable? Again, that's a very important question that arises when we look at the larger societal context, when we look at who's pushing people into the river and not simply how best to provide care to those who are in the river. So Weston goes on to argue that bioethics' tendency to marginalize larger social questions is in fact profoundly problematic, as this case highlights, for 2 reasons. We'll look at the first one and then we'll look at the second one. The first one is that it reinforces a tendency across our society to marginalize these questions. We tend to focus on individual impacts and individual decision making, and we tend not to focus on these larger societal problems. However, it's in part of the obligation of philosophical critical engagement to bring these overlooked issues into focus. That's part of what bioethics does, right? Bioethics helps us to focus on key critical components of case studies so that we can make better decisions. So if philosophical critical engagement is not looking at societal issues, then it's not performing its job, right? Or it's only performing half of its job, you know. So that bioethics does not ask critical social questions is part of the reason, too, that medical institutions can leave them marginalized. Because we're only focusing on critical questions or looking at the critical components of cases and questions and answers, etc., that occur in clinical settings, we are blind to the larger societal impacts, and we are encouraging the wider medical profession to also turn a blind eye to said societal impacts that influence the health of populations. Right? And that's what Weston argues. But social choices and systems, etc., impact health. Right? And he uses another example. Weston is very much into these stories, right? Suppose that you're an emergency medical professional and you've seen 10 accident victims come in within the week, right? And you're thinking, what the heck is going on? Like, all of these accident victims, and they're all coming from the same location. And, it seems like it would be crucial to know whether there's some special cause, right? And you're like, wow, like, or if you're watching Grey's Anatomy and then a whole bunch of people come in, because there's a traffic light malfunction, which I think they did a couple of times. You know, you would want to be like, "Hey, fix that traffic light," because our ER is being inundated with people seeking critical care because the traffic light is malfunctioning, right? So it seems like it's common sense to know whether there's some special issue cause for so many accidents and to address said cause to help get ahead of or to ensure the health of to ensure the health of the population, in those situations. So, partially because no one insists on such questions, they're systematically ignored or blocked within medical contexts, according to Weston. So, addressing these root causes helps to improve the health of patients. And as such, we need to include them within not only the bioethical purview, but within the medical purview as well. Wouldn't it be better if we only had one accident victim and then asked the question about whether or not, like, why was there an accident, and we fixed the problem before we have 10 or 20 accident victims in the ER? Weston argues that by asking and answering the societal questions and looking at the root causes, we can get ahead of problems so that we can ensure or better ensure the health of our populations, and indeed help ensure that included within the healthcare sphere and within the bioethics sphere, or should be separate from it. Should the responsibility of addressing these wide-ranging impacts that influence the health of populations be indicative of healthcare practice and of bioethics, or should it be separate? And should we develop robust, indeed, public health programs that then are responsible for addressing those? And again, this is a very live issue in bioethics right now that's particularly pronounced in the current context. And there are strong positions on both sides. So today I've presented you with Weston's argument, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you agree with Weston? Do you think he makes a convincing case here? So, should social components be included in bioethical analysis, or should we focus on questions that arise in clinical settings and that focus on professional ethics? And with that question, I will leave you, but I am very curious to hear what you think. So I hope that you have a great day, and I will see you on Friday.